The rain was falling in heavy sheets that blurred the empty road ahead, and Lukas Brandt told himself it would be the last job of the night. His work phone had buzzed just as he was halfway home, and though every part of him wanted to ignore it, the red code flashing on the screen meant extra pay he couldn't refuse. He glanced at the baby monitor app, saw Emma curled safely under her blankets with Mia watching from the couch, and pressed harder on the gas. The address looked wrong for his usual assignments, a grand estate tucked behind old stone gates, the sort of place where silence was thicker than walls. Still, he pulled in at 2:05 a.m., headlights catching the shimmer of rain on manicured hedges and lamps that flickered like tired eyes. He rang the bell twice, heard nothing, and noticed the front door wasn't fully latched. Every instinct told him to turn back, call dispatch, and write it off as a false alarm. But overtime hours didn't leave room for pride, and the storm was coming down harder. He pressed record on his badge, muttering a quick note that he was entering for safety reasons, and stepped inside. The air was cool, laced with the scent of lemon polish and old books, and the vast foyer stretched upward into darkness. A few wall sconces buzzed as though they were struggling for breath. Lukas wiped his boots at the threshold out of habit, then followed the faint hum of electrical current toward the back of the house. The breaker panel was worse than he expected, a mess of tangled wires patched with quick fixes and mismatched parts. He crouched, tools in hand, working carefully even as the lights above his head flickered in warning. One bulb popped with a small explosion, showering sparks across the floorboards. He hissed under his breath, steadying his hands. Whoever had last touched this system had left it one spark away from fire. He set about stabilizing it, his focus sharp, until he noticed something that didn't belong. At the end of the hallway, a soft glow seeped out from under a closed door. Not the harsh flicker of failing circuits, but a steady, warm light that seemed deliberate. He could have ignored it. His job was the wiring, nothing more. But curiosity had its own voltage, and something about that glow pulled him forward. He stood, wiped his palms on his jeans, and moved slowly down the corridor. The rain thudded against the windows, a rhythm in his ears as he stopped outside the door and knocked once. No answer. He pushed it open gently, the hinges sighing, and froze. A young woman stood barefoot on a rug, her long hair falling loosely over her shoulders, wearing a pale night dress that shimmered in the lamplight. She didn't startle at the sight of him, didn't rush to cover herself or demand he leave. Instead, she lifted a hand not to wave him closer or push him away, but simply to pause him there in the doorway. Her eyes were tired in a way he recognized immediately, the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than sleeplessness. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but carried a weight that made the air still. "Stay," she whispered. "Stay until it's over." Lukas felt something inside him tighten, the part of himself that remembered too many nights in hospital corridors, waiting for Emma's breathing to even out. Every rational thought told him to nod, apologize, and step back into the hallway. But there was a crack in her words, the sound of someone holding on by a thread, and he couldn't turn away from it. Lukas didn't move right away. He stood with one hand still resting on the doorframe, rain dripping from his jacket, his breath clouding faintly in the cool air. The woman's request echoed in his mind, a strange mix of fragility and command. Most nights he could walk away from anything that wasn't in his job description, but tonight the storm outside and the stillness inside pressed him forward. He stepped in carefully, setting his tool bag against the wall. The soft lamp in the corner glowed warm against the shadows, outlining her figure with a kind of quiet sadness. She lowered her hand slowly, as though she hadn't really expected him to obey. "I'm Lukas," he offered gently, his voice low so as not to disturb the strange calm in the room. She blinked, her lips parting just enough to shape a name. "Isabel," she said, her tone carrying more weight than the single word should. Neither asked why the other was there, as if explanations were irrelevant compared to the silence they shared. He lowered himself onto the edge of a chair opposite her, unsure if sitting made him an intruder or an anchor. Isabel's gaze followed him, and in the dim light Lukas saw a faint sheen of tears that hadn't yet fallen. She turned her head toward the fireplace, though no fire burned there, only the faint smell of ash and memory. He let the silence stretch, waiting to see if she would speak, but when her eyes found him again, she asked, "Do you fix more than wires?" The question struck him oddly. like she wanted more than just an electrician tonight. He swallowed, thinking of Emma, of her small voice asking if he could fix the stars when the hospital lights had scared her. "Sometimes," he said finally, "but mostly I just make sure the dark doesn't win." Isabel's mouth twitched, almost a smile, though it faltered before it could live. She leaned back against the sofa, her bare feet curling into the rug, and whispered, "Then maybe that's enough." Lukas forced his eyes away from her and toward the walls, scanning instinctively for the practical. The wiring here was dangerous, too old to carry the loads her family had likely forced through it. He rose, crossed to the lamp, and adjusted the connection he'd repaired earlier. The light steadied, humming with a more reliable warmth. Isabel watched him with a kind of detached curiosity, like she was seeing someone do something human in a house that had long forgotten it. "You shouldn't be here," she murmured. "No one stays after midnight." Her words made him frown. "Then why call in the emergency?" She hesitated, then admitted, "Because I couldn't stay in the dark anymore." Her honesty cut through him like a bare wire. He nodded, suddenly understanding more than he wanted to. He returned to the chair, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You're not alone tonight." The storm rattled the windows, and for a moment it seemed the whole house leaned against the weather. Lukas noticed her glance nervously at the door, as though she expected it to open again, but nothing moved except the shadows. He rubbed his palms together, trying to keep them steady, when her eyes finally locked on his and didn't look away. "They'll come back soon," she said. He stiffened. "Who will?" She shook her head faintly. "People who think everything I have belongs to them. People who never asked if I wanted it in the first place." Lukas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He knew the tone, knew it for men who owed debts they couldn't pay and women who carried names too heavy for their shoulders. "Then maybe you don't need them," he said quietly. Isabel exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and despair. "And maybe they don't need me, but they won't leave me to decide that." Somewhere in the house, a sound broke the fragile balance, a faint metallic clink, sharp and deliberate, not from the storm, not from the wiring. Lukas was on his feet before he could think, head tilted to listen. Isabel went rigid, her eyes flicking to the hallway. The lamp's glow seemed suddenly too bright, too revealing. He grabbed the flashlight from his belt and dimmed it with his hand. "Stay here," he whispered. She shook her head immediately, her voice a ghost against the thunder. "No. If you go out there, they'll know I'm not alone." He looked at her, really looked, and saw that she wasn't fragile after all. She was someone who had been forced to stand alone for too long, and she wasn't about to let him take her place in the line of fire. He pressed his lips together, jaw tight, and finally said, "Then we move together." Her breath caught, and for the first time that night her eyes softened. The clink came again, closer now, like footsteps testing their weight against the floorboards. Lukas flexed his grip on the flashlight, his other hand hovering near the heavy tool at his belt, and together they turned toward the door. The door shivered once, as though someone tested it with the back of a hand, then the silence stretched tight. Lukas raised a finger to his lips and motioned Isabel behind the piano in the corner. She moved quietly, bare feet gliding across the rug, her night dress brushing against the polished wood. Lukas took position near the doorframe, gripping the heavy multi-tool like a weapon, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had worked in enough abandoned warehouses to know the rhythm of a place when someone else was inside it. The house was too still, too deliberate, as though holding its breath for what came next. Lightning flashed outside, casting brief silver through the tall windows, and in that flicker Lukas saw a shadow pass across the hallway. Whoever it was moved with intent, not the clumsy step of a burglar, but the quiet practice of someone who belonged or believed they did. The handle turned slowly, almost casually, and Lukas pressed himself tighter against the wall, heart hammering. Isabel's breath hitched audibly, and he shook his head, steadying her with a glance even though she was half hidden. The door pushed open just enough to let in a blade of dark from the hall. A figure slipped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, with a flashlight clipped low to avoid revealing his face. Lukas shifted, ready to strike, but the intruder spoke first in a low voice that crawled across the silence. "Miss Hartmann," he said. Isabel flinched, recognizing her name. The man's tone was neither friendly nor hostile, something worse, something practiced. "Your uncle sent me. He doesn't trust you'll follow through." Lukas tightened his grip, stepping into the narrow light of the lamp so the man could see him. Then he sent you to the wrong house, Lukas said. The stranger's eyes flicked to him, and the faintest smirk crossed his lips. And who are you supposed to be? The help? The words might have been meant as an insult, but Lukas didn't take the bait. I fix things, he said evenly, and I don't like people breaking them. The man chuckled, though there was no humor in it. He took one step further into the room, the floor groaning under his weight, and pulled a sealed envelope from his coat pocket. He tossed it onto the desk with a casual flick. The terms are clear. If she doesn't sign by her birthday, everything shifts to the board. She knows that. Isabel rose from behind the piano, her voice steady though her hands trembled. And if I don't sign? The man shrugged, as though the outcome meant nothing to him. Then the house, the company, the estate, it all passes on. And you, he said, eyes narrowing. You become a very expensive problem. Lukas stepped between them instinctively, blocking the man's line of sight to her. Sounds like you came a long way just to deliver paper, he said. What's the real message? The man tilted his head, studying Lukas like he was an equation to solve. The message is simple. She doesn't get to decide alone. She either plays her part or she watches everything burn. The last word lingered like smoke in the air. Lukas's stomach tightened. He could hear the certainty in the man's tone. Whoever sent him wasn't bluffing. Isabel lifted the envelope with slow, careful fingers, but instead of opening it, she let it fall back to the desk. Tell my uncle, she said, her voice low and cold, that I won't be ordered in my own house. The man's smirk vanished, replaced with something darker. He reached inside his coat again, this time not for paper, but for metal. Lukas lunged forward before the weapon cleared its holster, grabbing the man's wrist with both hands and twisting hard. The pistol clattered to the floor, skittering under the sofa. The man cursed, driving his elbow into Lukas's ribs, but Lukas held on, shoving him backward against the desk. The lamp toppled, plunging half the room into shadow. Isabel darted forward, kicking the gun further out of reach, her eyes blazing. The struggle was raw, violent in a way Lukas hadn't experienced in years, but desperation gave him strength. He forced the man to the ground, his knee pressing into his chest, and snarled, "You don't belong here." The intruder coughed, his smirk somehow returning even through the pressure. "Neither do you." Then, with surprising strength, he twisted free, slamming his shoulder into Lukas and rolling toward the door. Lukas scrambled after him, but the man slipped into the hall, footsteps pounding into the darkness beyond. The silence that followed was broken only by Isabel's shaky breathing and the hammer of Lukas's own heartbeat. He retrieved the lamp, setting it upright with trembling hands, and looked at her. "This won't stop here," he said. "He'll be back. Maybe not alone." Isabel nodded, her face pale but resolute. "I know," she whispered. Her eyes fell on the envelope still lying on the desk, rainwater from the man's coat staining the corner. She reached for it slowly, fingers brushing the paper like it might burn her. Lukas stepped closer, laying his hand gently over hers to stop her. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight we survive." Isabel met his gaze, and for the first time there was no mask in her expression, only raw fear mixed with something deeper trust. The storm outside roared louder, rattling the windows, as if the whole world leaned in to hear what they would do next. Lukas double-checked the locks on the doors, though he knew they wouldn't hold forever. The estate was too old, the frames too warped, the hardware too ornamental to keep out men who had already forced their way inside once. He moved through the halls with the flashlight angled low, every sense on high alert. Isabel followed a few paces behind, clutching the edge of her night dress like it might anchor her. The letter lay abandoned on the desk, the storm pressing against the windows, and the echo of the intruder's words still hung in the air. Lukas wanted nothing more than to be home with Emma, to know she was safe. But now that someone had spoken Isabel's name with such confidence, leaving her alone felt like walking away from a fire while it spread to the next room. They reached the back of the house, where the breaker panel hummed faintly. Lukas crouched, inspecting the lines he had patched earlier, and frowned. Someone had tampered with the circuits before he arrived, deliberately crossing feeds to create surges. This wasn't neglect. It was sabotage. He exhaled sharply, rubbing at the bruise forming along his ribs from the fight. "Your uncle didn't just send a messenger," he muttered. "He's been pulling strings in your walls for months." Isabel wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the heat of the lamp. I should have known. Every room in this house feels like it belongs to him more than to me. Lukas stood, brushing dust from his hands, and shook his head. Then we take it back, piece by piece. But first, we make it through the night. They retreated to the study, where Isabel lit a few more candles. The flames threw shadows up the walls, illuminating bookshelves filled with volumes that smelled of dust and perfume. Lukas closed the heavy drapes, making the room less of a target. Isabel sat on the piano bench, her bare feet curling under her, and looked at him as though searching for a shape in the dark. "You don't have to be here," she whispered. Lukas tightened his jaw. "Neither do you. But here we are." For a long moment she said nothing, then leaned forward, winding the small music box she had set on the desk. A fragile melody spilled into the air, tinny but haunting, the kind of sound that made silence feel less like emptiness and more like memory. Lukas sat across from her, watching her fingers trace the worn wood. "My mother used to play this," Isabel said softly. "It was the only thing that made this house feel alive." He didn't answer right away, just listened, the notes pulling at something deep in him. Finally, he said, "Emma has a stuffed bear. She won't sleep without it. When she was in the hospital, I thought it was ridiculous. Just a piece of fabric. But I realized it was more than that. It was proof she wasn't alone." Isabel's eyes lifted to his, glimmering in the candlelight. "And tonight," she asked, "what's proof for you?" Lukas considered, then leaned back with a tired half-smile. "That I didn't walk away when I had the chance." The music box wound down, its last notes fading into the storm's steady roar. The quiet that followed didn't last. A thud shook the ceiling, faint but deliberate. Lukas was on his feet instantly, scanning the room. "They're still here," he said. Isabel's knuckles whitened against the bench. He moved to the door, pistol heavy in his hand, and listened. The sound came again, closer this time, the unmistakable rhythm of boots on wood. Whoever had retreated earlier hadn't left at all. They had circled back. Lukas looked at Isabel, his expression sharp. "We don't wait for them to come to us. We move." She rose, her face pale but determined, and nodded. "Then where?" He glanced toward the far end of the room, where the shelves stood taller than the doorframe. "You said once this house wasn't built for you. Maybe it's time we find the parts it forgot." Isabel's eyes widened. Then she hurried to the back shelf, pulling down a row of books until her fingers found a latch hidden behind them. The wall gave a soft click, and a narrow passage yawned open into darkness. The pounding on the ceiling grew louder, dust drifting down from the beams. Lukas grabbed the flashlight, motioning Isabel into the passage first. She hesitated, glancing back at him, and he gave a sharp nod. "Go. I'll be right behind you." She stepped into the black corridor, the smell of damp stone wrapping around her. Lukas followed, pulling the shelf shut just as the study door rattled with another forceful blow. The music box toppled from the desk, its lid snapping shut, cutting off the melody mid-note. In the silence that followed, the house seemed to exhale. Lukas steadied his breathing in the narrow passage, the weight of the dark pressing on his shoulders. Ahead, Isabel's voice trembled just enough to remind him she was still human. "Where does it lead?" Lukas adjusted his grip on the pistol, flashlight beam trembling against the old stone. "Wherever it does," he whispered back. "But anywhere's better than here." The tunnel narrowed as they moved, their footsteps muffled by the damp stone beneath them. Lukas held the flashlight low, its weak beams skimming over crumbling mortar and old timbers that creaked with age. Isabel kept close, one hand brushing the wall as if she needed the contact to steady herself. The air grew colder, carrying the faint smell of wine and dust, and Lukas guessed they were heading toward the old cellars beneath the house. Behind them, the thudding on the study door had stopped, replaced by the faint scrape of boots searching. Whoever was hunting them knew the house as well as Isabel did, maybe better. Lukas tightened his grip on the pistol and pushed them faster, every nerve alert. They reached a grated opening that looked out into a cellar lined with racks of dusty bottles. Isabel leaned against the bars, her breath visible in the damp chill. "It's locked," she whispered, frustration bleeding into her voice. Lukas knelt, running the flashlight over the old iron mechanism. "Locks are just puzzles," he muttered, pulling a thin screwdriver from his belt. His hands moved quickly, muscle memory guiding him. Isabel crouched beside him, her eyes flicking to the dark beyond the grate. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Lukas paused, listening. A faint hum, mechanical, not from the storm. It grew louder, steady and deliberate, until he realized what it was: generators. Whoever had come wasn't just breaking in. They had their own power running somewhere nearby. The lock gave way with a rusty click, and Lukas pulled the gate open, waving Isabel through. She stepped lightly into the cellar, her eyes darting to the shelves stacked high with her father's legacy. Dust clung to the labels, some bottles older than her, but none of it mattered now. The hum of the generator pulsed through the stone like a second heartbeat. Lukas moved along the wall, flashlight cutting across shadows, until he spotted a narrow door at the far end. He tested it, opened easily, swinging onto a corridor that sloped upward. Isabel caught his arm. "That leads outside," she said. "Near the gardens." Lukas nodded. "Then it's our way out." Before they could step through, voices echoed faintly down the stone. Two men, speaking low, their words carried by the acoustics of the cellar. Lukas pulled Isabel back into the shadows, switching off the flashlight. They pressed against the racks, the smell of cork and mildew filling their lungs. The men drew closer, their footsteps slow and unhurried, like hunters certain their prey was cornered. Lukas steadied his breathing, pistol held ready. Isabel's hand found his in the dark, her grip tight, her fear unspoken but clear. The voices grew louder, one of the men laughing softly. "She won't run far," he said. "Not with the papers in the safe." Lukas felt Isabel stiffen at his side. The other voice answered, colder. "The safe's a distraction. The uncle only cares that she signs. Everything else we can burn." Lukas made his decision in a heartbeat. He leaned close to Isabel, whispering so low it was almost breath. "When I move, you run for the garden door. Don't stop." She shook her head fiercely, whispering back, "Not without you." But before he could argue, the beam of a flashlight swept across the cellar, landing inches from their hiding place. The men were only a few steps away now, their shadows stretching across the racks. Lukas pressed Isabel lower, then braced himself. The first intruder turned the corner, his light catching Lukas's face for an instant, and that was enough. Lukas lunged, slamming the man into the bottles, glass shattering as red wine sprayed like blood. The second man shouted, raising his weapon, but Isabel snatched a heavy bottle from the rack and swung it with desperate strength. The glass connected with a crack, sending the man sprawling. Chaos erupted in the cellar, wine pouring across the floor, boots scrambling for balance, the pistol skittering across stone. Lukas drove his shoulder into the first man's chest, forcing him back toward the wall. Isabel kicked the fallen flashlight, plunging them all into a swirl of dark and sound. "Go," Lukas barked. She grabbed his arm instead, refusing to leave. Together they fought through the shadows, Lukas's fist connecting, Isabel's breath ragged in the dark. When the noise finally stilled, both men lay motionless on the ground, one groaning faintly, the other knocked cold. Lukas's chest heaved as he retrieved the pistol, his knuckles raw and bleeding. Isabel clutched the broken neck of a bottle, her hands shaking now that the danger had paused. Their eyes met in the dark, and without words they both knew the night wasn't close to finished. The hum of the generator still pulsed in the distance, steady and relentless. Lukas wiped his brow with the back of his hand, his voice rough. "They're not done. More will come." Isabel swallowed hard, her jaw set. "Then we stop running." She lifted her chin, the candlelight from the passage flickering across her face. "This house was built to keep people like me silent. Maybe tonight it learns I'm not." Lukas stared at her, seeing for the first time not just grief but steel beneath it. He nodded once. "Then we finish this together." The garden door groaned as Lukas forced it open, the hinges stiff with rust from years of neglect. Cold rain swept in, soaking them instantly as they stepped into the overgrown path that twisted away from the cellar. The storm painted everything in silver and shadow, hedges bowing under the weight of water, branches snapping in the wind. Isabel shivered, but she didn't slow down. Lukas kept the pistol raised in one hand, his flashlight clenched in the other, cutting arcs across the darkness. The hum of the generator was louder out here, vibrating faintly through the ground, and when Lukas scanned toward the far edge of the estate, he saw the glow of artificial light hidden behind the trees. Whoever had come tonight hadn't been improvising. They had prepared. They moved quickly, keeping low, the sound of rain covering their steps. Isabel stumbled once on the wet gravel, catching herself on Lucas's arm. "How many do you think there are?" she asked, her voice raw. Lucas didn't answer right away, his eyes fixed on the treeling. Finally, he said, "Enough to think they can scare you into signing. Not enough to understand you won't." Her lips pressed tight, a flash of defiance breaking through the fear. "Then they don't know me at all." They reached a break in the hedges, and Lucas held her back, crouching low. Ahead, near the glow of the generator, 2 more men patrolled with rifles slung casually across their shoulders, their silhouettes sharp against the rain. One smoked a cigarette, its ember flaring like a beacon in the dark. Isabel's grip tightened on his sleeve. "We can't fight them all." Lucas nodded grimly. "No, but we don't have to. We just need them off balance." He studied the generator, its cables running to a makeshift panel protected by a tarp. "They want this house lit. They want control. We take that away, even for a minute, and they'll be blind." He crouched lower, explaining quickly, "When I move, you circle left. Stay in the shadows until you're past them. There's a side gate in the stone wall. If we split, they can't track us both." Isabel shook her head, rain streaking down her face. "No, I'm not leaving you." He gave her a sharp look, but her expression didn't waver. "I've been running from my family's shadow all my life. If I keep running tonight, I'll never stop. I stay with you." Lucas swallowed hard, then nodded once, accepting what he couldn't change. "Then we moved together." They waited for the cigarette ember to flare again. Then Lucas hurled a rock into the opposite hedge. The sharp crack drew both guards instantly, their flashlights stabbing into the brush. Lucas seized the moment, sprinting low toward the generator, Isabel right on his heels. He dropped to one knee, yanked open the panel, and ripped free the main feed. Sparks erupted, the hum dying in a choking whine. Darkness swallowed the clearing. Shouts rang out, flashlights swinging wildly. One beam caught Lucas across the shoulder, and a rifle cracked, the bullet splintering wood inches from his head. He shoved Isabel down, firing back once, the shot echoing like thunder. Chaos spread, voices yelling, boots crashing through wet grass, beams cutting frantically through the storm. Isabel crawled beside him, her hair plastered to her face, her breath ragged. "They know where we are," she gasped. Lucas grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the side gate. "Then we don't give them a straight path." They weaved through the hedges, mud sucking at their shoes, bullets snapping through branches behind them. The gate appeared in the gloom, half hidden by ivy, the lock heavy and rusted. Lucas slammed his shoulder into it once, twice, until the iron gave with a screech. They burst through onto the narrow service road beyond, rain lashing at their faces. For a heartbeat, Lucas thought they had a chance. Then headlights flared down the road, blinding white in the storm. An SUV skidded to a halt, doors flying open, more men spilling out with weapons drawn. Isabel froze, terror flashing across her features. Lucas raised the pistol, but he knew he couldn't take them all. His mind raced, searching for an option, any option, when one of the men stepped forward under the headlights. He wasn't like the others. He wore no mask, no rushed aggression. His suit was dark and perfectly pressed despite the rain, his expression calm and sharp. Even at a distance, Isabel's body stiffened, her voice breaking as she whispered, "It's him." Lucas glanced at her, seeing the fury in her eyes even through her fear. "Your uncle?" he asked. Isabel nodded once, her fists curling at her sides. The man raised a hand, his voice carrying easily over the storm. "You've made this harder than it needs to be, Isabel. Come back inside. Sign the papers. End this." She stood taller despite her shaking, her voice steady as she shouted back, "You'll never own me." The man's smile was thin, almost pitying. "Then I'll own the silence you leave behind." His words sliced through the rain, a promise more dangerous than the guns aimed at them. Lucas tightened his grip on the pistol, every muscle taut. The storm was no longer their worst enemy. The road was slick beneath Lucas's boots as he planted himself between Isabel and the line of men blocking their path. The storm seemed to hold its breath, rain softening for a fleeting moment, as if even the sky wanted to hear what came next. Isabel's uncle stood unmoving, his guards forming a wall of shadows behind him. The pistol felt heavy in Lucas's hand, but not as heavy as the thought of Emma's face if he didn't make it home. His voice cut through the night, sharp and steady. You want her signature? You'll have to go through me first. A ripple of laughter moved through the guards, but Isabel's uncle didn't smile. He stepped forward into the headlights, his expression calm, his suit immaculate despite the weather. You're not part of this, Mr. Brandt, he said coolly. You're a distraction, and distractions disappear. He flicked his fingers, and two of the men advanced, rifles raised. Lukas fired once, the crack echoing off the stone walls. One man dropped, the other dove for cover. Chaos erupted, flashlights whipping through the storm, shouts breaking the night's fragile stillness. Lukas pulled Isabel into the ditch along the roadside, mud soaking them both, and whispered harshly, "Run when I tell you." But she shook her head fiercely, gripping his arm. "I'm not leaving you. Not now, not ever." A burst of gunfire chewed into the road, sparks leaping as bullets ricocheted. Lukas aimed again, firing into the headlights of the SUV. Glass shattered, plunging the scene into partial darkness. The sudden blindness gave them a breath of cover. He grabbed Isabel's hand, hauling her to her feet, and together they sprinted down the narrow path that cut toward the outer wall. Rain blinded him, his lungs burned, but he didn't dare slow. Shouts chased them, boots pounding, but the storm was on their side now, masking every step with thunder and wind. They reached the wall, ivy clinging to the wet stone, and Lukas boosted Isabel upward. She scrambled, slipping, before pulling herself onto the ledge. She extended her hand down to him, her eyes blazing with determination. "Take it," she shouted. Lukas hesitated only long enough to fire one last shot into the darkness behind them before seizing her hand. They collapsed on the far side of the wall, gasping in the mud, the storm still raging overhead. For a long moment neither spoke, the adrenaline rattling through their bones. Finally, Isabel rolled onto her side, clutching the earth like it was proof she was alive. "He won't stop," she whispered. Lukas sat up, wiping blood from his brow, his voice rough but certain. "Then neither will we." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the soaked envelope the intruder had dropped earlier. The ink had bled, but the signatures, the demands, the threats were still legible. He tore it in half, the paper dissolving in the rain, and let the pieces scatter into the ditch. Isabel watched, her chest heaving, and for the first time that night she smiled, fragile but real. By the time dawn broke, the storm had spent itself, leaving the estate scarred and silent. Smoke still rose faintly from the generator, shattered glass littered the drive, and the once imposing mansion looked smaller, stripped of its illusions. Lukas stood with Isabel at the edge of the property, the pistol heavy at his side, mud streaking his clothes. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and when he saw Mia's name flash across the screen, relief surged through him. "Emma's safe?" Mia's voice assured when he answered. His knees nearly buckled with gratitude. When he hung up, Isabel was watching him, her eyes softer than he had ever seen them. "You should go to her," she said quietly. Lukas shook his head. "I will. But first, we finish this." They turned together, walking away from the estate, leaving behind the broken lights, the shattered windows, and the ghosts of her father's empire. What they carried instead was the promise that they had chosen not to bend, not to sign, not to surrender. Lukas slipped his hand into Isabel's, mud and rain still clinging to their skin, and she held it tightly, her steps sure beside him. For both of them, survival had always meant patching broken circuits and enduring empty silences. But that night proved something neither had dared to hope, that sometimes, when the world tries to smother you in darkness, the only answer is to stay until it's over. And when it is, to step into whatever fragile daylight comes next together.